And of course, you've got a book coming out this June, Thunder Run, Mactilla, 1945. And
Yes.
I guess in some ways, is this an expansion onto your previous book, which great title, by the way, Forgotten Armor, Tank Warfare in Burma?
Yeah, I couldn't miss the opportunity writing about the Burma campaign, the Forgotten Army, Forgotten Armor thing.
Of Slim,
Um,
yeah.
yes, yeah, yeah. It's an amazing, yeah, it really was born out of the inspiration from the first book, which is all just very specifically about tank warfare in that campaign. In the Burma campaign, it's not just jungle and infantry slogging through that sort of thing. Um, and I knew about the Reconquest campaign. I've studied this campaign and so on. But it was just when I really got into looking at that chapter in particular, it was my favourite chapter to write. And I was like, there's a much bigger story here because there's so many moving parts that you just don't get the opportunity to do when it's a single chapter. So I was like, that's got to be the next one. And the other interesting thing is that the title for the second book, Thunder Run, is inspired by it's inspired by a couple of different things. When I was doing my master's, where I first got into the tank warfare and Burma thing, we were studying the Thunder Run to Baghdad in 2003, but we also was it was at the same time that Putin invaded Russia, and he
Yeah,
did the invasion south from Belarus, the drive to try and capture Kyiv in 3 days,
yeah,
that failed miserably. And
right.
it was kind of like we started talking about in our little masters group on the comparisons between what happened in 2003 in Iraq and what was going wrong in 2022 in Ukraine. And I was about to start the dissertation about tank warfare, and all those three things happened at the same time. And that's where it all came from, and a fantastic time I've had writing it because it's such a great story.
Yeah, of course. And I think I could, well, speaking for the general public, for those who even know a little bit about the Pacific War, I think Burma it's one of the last theaters that comes to mind. And I think for the general public, there's quite a vagueness about Burma. And I think it's due to the geography. It's a little complex. I think it's a little alien to Western audiences. And to be blunt, it's never emphasized. I've read more than 50 books in the Pacific War, and I have to admit, it's always cast to the side, and it's tragic because it's one of the most interesting theaters. It's very unique. Like you said, it's not just jungle, but my God, it is quite a interesting terrain when it is the
Mm.
jungle warfare with the Chindits, for example. But yeah, I guess the first question I have to say before we jump into, the Battle of Mactilla is like exactly why is there a Burma campaign in the first place?
Yeah, yeah, and sort of just to address what you're saying there as well, I think it's quite important to think about how the Burma campaign is as part of the Pacific campaign. It isn't the central decisive theatre. I'm not trying to pretend that, and no legitimate historian really should be. None of my friends and colleagues that who study this, we know that the Burma campaign is not the Forgotten Army thing is a real thing for multiple different reasons. The reason they're called that. They are called that because it is not an existential threat to the British Isles from the British point of view, and the Pacific War, the Pacific campaign, or the Philippines campaign, obviously, the rivalry between the Navy and the Army and MacArthur and so on. That is the central drive to Japan. This is not about pretending that. The Burma campaign, though, and again, apologies to your listeners who may be expert on a lot of this stuff, but the main point of the Burma campaign really is about trying to keep China in the war so that all of those Japanese soldiers that are fighting in China, however many divisions it is, they don't get redeployed into the Philippines, into all of the different islands on the island hopping campaign.
Yeah,
That is the ultimate point.
yeah, absolutely. And considering the relationship that Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek will have, it is very eventful, the entire campaign. And it's not just a battle of of soldiers, but certainly there's a lot of
Wills.
diplomacy. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's the relationship between them is fascinating. And obviously Stillwell thrown into the mix is unhelpful. But you know what? The diplomacy, Lord Mountbatten, Louis Mountbatten, the Queen's uncle, he has a really important role there. Because he's very, very charming. You know, everybody loves him generally, generally speaking. I mean, the Irish not so much, perhaps, but you know, considering what happens. But you know, you know what I mean. I think the other thing as well that we just have to consider is that there is the wounded pride a little bit of the British. You know, the loss of Malaya and Singapore. You know, Singapore is a far more serious thing than Dunkirk in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Certainly for Britain's, you know, prestige as an imperial power. Certainly, you know, it's a really important reason for the retreat back west of Suez. You know, no longer being British Empire is no longer east of Suez, and so on after the Second World War. And Indian independence and all sorts of independent movements across Asia from the British Empire, you know, really stem from the loss of Singapore, and obviously a lot of those consequences I'm referring to are after the Second World War. But the sense that they need to do something to regain that pride in Asia, you know, a very Asian concept of face. The British in particular need to save face, which is mostly seen as a Chinese concept, but it does exist across the whole of Asia. And so they feel the need to go